Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in and let's begin. The three Comanche women stood in Henri Beaumont's cabin like visions from a dream he'd never dared to have. Étoile, with her raven-black hair and eyes that sparkled like captured starlight, stood by his fireplace with the confidence of a queen surveying her domain. Beside her, Fleur moved with the fluid grace of a dancer, her gentle smile lighting up the dim interior like morning sunshine breaking through storm clouds. The third sister, Sage, remained near the door, her warrior's bearing and calculating gaze making it clear she was the protector of the group. For 7 years, Henri had lived alone on this remote Texas ranch, and now his solitary world was about to shatter completely. "We seek sanctuary," Étoile announced in accented English, her voice carrying the musical cadence of her native tongue. "Our father was killed by soldiers who claimed we harbored outlaws. Our village was burned. Our people scattered to the winds. We have nowhere else to turn." Her words hit Henri like a physical blow, awakening a protective instinct he'd thought died with his family years ago. The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and he could see the exhaustion etched in all three women's faces despite their proud bearing. Henri's heart hammered against his ribs as he studied their faces, seeing strength forged in suffering and beauty that transcended mere physical appearance. Étoile's intelligence shone through her dark eyes, while Fleur's gentleness radiated warmth that made his lonely cabin feel like a home for the first time in years. But it was the combination of both sisters that truly undid him. How could a man choose between starlight and sunshine, between brilliance and kindness? The very thought seemed like a betrayal of both. "Of course you can stay," Henri said without hesitation, though his voice cracked slightly with emotion. "This ranch is big enough for all of us, and any enemy of injustice is a friend of mine." The relief that flooded across all three faces was so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He'd made his choice to help them, but deep in his heart, he knew a more difficult choice was coming. One that would test the very foundations of his honor and threaten to tear apart the fragile sanctuary they were building together. As night fell and the sisters settled into the spare room he hastily prepared, Henri lay awake staring at the ceiling and wondering how he'd fallen in love with two women in the span of a single afternoon. The impossibility of his situation should have terrified him, but instead he felt more alive than he had in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight his empty ranch was filled with voices, laughter, and the promise of a future he'd never imagined possible. 6 months earlier, Henri had been a different man entirely. Born in Louisiana to French settlers who'd taught him that honor was worth more than gold, he'd come west after losing his wife and newborn son to fever. The grief had nearly destroyed him, driving him to seek isolation in the vast Texas wilderness, where his pain couldn't touch anyone else. He'd bought the ranch with the last of his inheritance, planning to live out his days in solitude, tending cattle and trying to forget the laughter that would never again fill his home. The first years had been brutal. Henri learned ranching through trial and error, his soft city hands becoming calloused and strong as he built fences, broke horses, and fought off wolves and rustlers. The loneliness ate at him like a slow poison, but he embraced it as penance for surviving when his family hadn't. He talked to his cattle, sang French lullabies to the empty sky, and marked the passage of time by the seasons rather than days. The nearest town was a 2-day ride away, and he made the journey only when absolutely necessary for supplies. But isolation had also given him strength. Henri had become a formidable marksman, a skilled horseman, and a man who could survive anything the frontier threw at him. His ranch prospered despite his solitude, with his cattle thriving in the rich grassland he'd claimed. Neighbors knew him as the mysterious Frenchman who minded his own business and helped anyone in genuine need, though few had ever seen him up close. His reputation for fairness and quiet strength had spread throughout the territory. The cabin he'd built with his own hands reflected his simple needs: functional, clean, and large enough for one man's quiet life. He'd never imagined needing space for guests, especially not three beautiful women who would turn his ordered world upside down. The spare room had been used only for storage, filled with memories he'd tried to pack away, like the baby clothes and wedding ring he couldn't bear to look at but couldn't bring himself to burn. Now, as he listened to the soft voices of the sisters settling in for their first night under his roof, Henri realized his 7 years of solitude had been preparation for this moment. Every skill he'd learned, every strength he'd developed, every wall he'd built around his heart, it had all been leading to the night when 3 Comanche women would appear on his doorstep and change everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and the courage required to build a new life from the ashes of the old. The next morning brought revelations that made Henri's head spin with their implications. As Étoile helped him tend to the horses, her knowledge of the animals revealed itself to be extraordinary. She could calm the most skittish mare with a whispered word and seemed to understand their needs better than Henri himself. "My grandmother taught me," she explained when he commented on her skill. "She said horses see into our souls and judge us accordingly. They trust you because your heart is good, even though it carries much pain." Her insight into his hidden grief caught him off guard, and Henri found himself sharing stories he'd never told another living soul. Étoile listened with a compassion that seemed to draw the poison from old wounds, her questions gentle but probing enough to help him process emotions he'd buried for years. When he finally told her about Marie and little Jean-Baptiste, the wife and son he'd lost, she placed her hand over his heart and spoke words in Comanche that he somehow understood meant healing and hope. Meanwhile, Fleur had transformed his practical kitchen into something magical, cooking with wild herbs and spices that filled the cabin with aromas that reminded Henri of his mother's cooking in distant Louisiana. She sang while she worked, her voice weaving through the morning air like liquid gold, and Henri found himself humming along to melodies he'd never heard but somehow knew by heart. When she smiled at him over the breakfast she'd prepared, he felt his carefully constructed walls crumbling like sand castles before the tide. Sage spent the morning on the porch, cleaning weapons with the practiced efficiency of a professional warrior. Her vigilance was constant, her eyes scanning the horizon for threats that Henri couldn't see but trusted were real. When he asked about their journey to his ranch, her account revealed narrow escapes from cavalry patrols, bounty hunters, and hostile settlers who shot first and asked questions of dead Indians. The sisters had been running for weeks, fighting for survival every mile of the way. As the day progressed, Henri realized each sister possessed qualities that complemented the others perfectly: Étoile's wisdom and intuition, Fleur's warmth and creativity, Sage's strength and protection. Together, they formed a unit more formidable than any individual could be alone. But it was his growing feelings for both Étoile and Fleur that kept him awake that second night, staring at the stars and wondering how a man could love 2 women without destroying them all in the process. By the end of their first week together, Henri knew he was in serious trouble. Every morning brought new reasons to admire both Étoile and Fleur, and every evening found him torn between conflicting desires that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Étoile challenged his mind with deep conversations about philosophy, astronomy, and the nature of existence, while Fleur touched his soul with her gentle humor, artistic talents, and intuitive understanding of his emotional needs. The practical arrangements were becoming increasingly complicated. Henri had insisted the sisters take the main bedroom while he slept on the porch, but the cramped quarters meant they were constantly in close contact. When Étoile helped him repair a broken fence, their hands would brush as they worked, sending electricity through his entire body. When Fleur tended a cut he'd received from barbed wire, her gentle ministrations felt more intimate than any touch he'd ever experienced. Sage watched these interactions with growing concern, her protective instincts clearly aroused by the tension she could see building between her sisters and their host. She'd begun taking longer hunting trips, leaving Étoile and Fleur alone with Henri for hours at a time, whether by design or chance, he couldn't tell. But her absence only intensified the emotional pressure building in the small cabin, as unspoken feelings charged the air like an approaching thunderstorm. The breaking point came during an evening when Fleur was teaching Henri to braid leather, while Étoile read aloud from a book of poetry she'd salvaged from their destroyed village. The domestic intimacy of the scene, the three of them working and learning together in the firelight, felt so natural and right that Henri's heart ached with longing. This was what family felt like, what home was supposed to be, and the knowledge that it couldn't last was almost unbearable. When Fleur's fingers lingered on his as she guided his hands through a particularly complex braid, and Étoile looked up from her book with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his conflicted soul, Henri knew the moment of truth was approaching. He was falling in love with both sisters, and worse, he was beginning to suspect they might be developing feelings for him as well. The situation was impossible, potentially destructive, and absolutely against every code of honor he'd ever lived by. But his heart refused to listen to reason. The morning that changed everything started like any other, but Henri could feel tension crackling in the air like the static before a lightning strike. Sage had left before dawn on another hunting expedition, leaving behind a meaningful look that seemed to say she trusted him to behave honorably with her sisters. But honor was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain when every glance, every accidental touch, every shared laugh seemed to deepen the connections growing between all three of them. Étoile found him mending harness leather in the barn, and their conversation quickly turned from practical matters to deeper questions about love, loyalty, and the courage required to follow one's heart despite societal expectations. "In my culture," she said carefully, "the heart is considered sacred, too pure to be bound by laws made by men who fear what they don't understand. Sometimes the spirits bring people together in ways that seem impossible, but are actually inevitable." Her words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Henri's pulse race. Before he could respond, Fleur appeared in the barn doorway, her arms full of wildflowers she'd gathered for the cabin. The sight of both sisters together in the golden morning light was so beautiful, it literally took his breath away, and for a moment, he couldn't speak or move or think of anything except how much he wanted to hold them both and never let go. "Henri," Fleur said softly, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that was unlike her usual confidence. "We need to talk about what's happening between us, all of us. Sage has noticed the changes, and she's concerned about where this path might lead." Her honesty was like a splash of cold water, forcing Henri to confront the reality of their situation instead of losing himself in romantic fantasies that could destroy them all. The three of them sat in the hay, forming a circle that somehow felt both natural and ceremonial. For the first time since the sisters' arrival, they spoke openly about the feelings that had been building between them, the attraction, the confusion, the growing sense that they were meant to be together despite the impossibility of such an arrangement. By the time their conversation ended, they'd crossed a line that would change everything, and Henri knew there was no going back to the simple host and guest relationship they'd started with. That evening, Sage returned from her hunt with more than game. She brought news that chilled Henri's blood and explained why the sisters had been so careful to avoid detection. "Cavalry patrol passed 5 miles south," she reported grimly. 20 soldiers led by Captain Morrison, the same man who burned our village and killed our father. They're following our trail, asking questions in every settlement." Someone told them about 3 Comanche women heading toward this area. The implications hit Henri like a physical blow. Harboring fugitive Indians was a federal crime punishable by imprisonment or death, and Captain Morrison had a reputation for shoot-first justice that made him one of the most feared men on the frontier. But as Henri looked at the 3 sisters, Étoile's intelligent courage, Fleur's gentle strength, Sage's fierce loyalty, he knew he'd rather die than turn them over to a man who saw them as nothing more than obstacles to be eliminated. "There's something else you need to know," Sage continued, her voice heavy with secrets that had clearly been weighing on her conscience. "Our father wasn't just any village chief. He was keeper of the sacred bundle. Ancient artifacts that some believe hold power over the spirit world. Morrison didn't kill him for harboring outlaws. He killed him trying to steal those artifacts for a collector back east who pays enormous sums for authentic Indian relics." Étoile and Fleur exchanged meaningful glances before Étoile spoke. "We carry the bundle with us. It's hidden in the forest, but if Morrison finds it—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Henri understood that they weren't just refugees fleeing persecution. They were guardians of something sacred, protectors of their people's most precious spiritual heritage. The weight of that responsibility, combined with their growing personal feelings, created a burden that seemed almost too heavy to bear. The revelation transformed everything Henri thought he knew about their situation. This wasn't just about 3 women seeking sanctuary. It was about preserving something ancient and irreplaceable, about standing up to corruption and greed that threatened to destroy everything pure and sacred in the world. As he looked into their faces, seeing the trust they'd placed in him by sharing this ultimate secret, Henri realized he wasn't just falling in love with 2 women. He was being called to join a sacred mission that would test every belief he held about honor, courage, and the price of doing what was right. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation and growing intimacy that made Henri's heart race with equal parts joy and terror. By day, they planned escape routes and hiding places, stockpiled supplies, and prepared for the confrontation they all knew was coming. By night, they drew closer together, sharing stories, fears, and dreams that bonded them in ways deeper than romance, though the romantic tension continued to build like pressure in a steam kettle. Henri found himself alone with Étoile, while Fleur and Sage scouted the southern approach to the ranch. In the golden afternoon light, she looked like a painting of an ancient goddess, wise and beautiful and utterly captivating. "I must tell you something," she said quietly, her eyes serious. "In my culture, it's possible for a woman to love more than one man, and for men to share wives if all parties agree and honor is maintained. But I don't know if your culture could accept such arrangements." Her words sent his heart hammering against his ribs. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" he asked, hardly daring to breathe. Étoile nodded slowly, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and determination. "Fleur and I have talked. We both feel something strong for you, and you clearly feel something for both of us. Perhaps there's a way to honor these feelings without destroying the bonds between us." That evening, Fleur approached him with similar honesty, her gentle nature making the conversation feel like a prayer rather than a proposition. "I know it seems impossible," she said, taking his hands in hers. "But the heart doesn't always follow the rules men make. If you could love us both, and if we could love you and each other as sisters should, perhaps we could build something beautiful together, a family bound by choice rather than tradition." Henri felt like his world was spinning off its axis. Everything he'd been taught about love, marriage, and proper relationships was being challenged by these remarkable women who saw possibilities where he saw only problems. But as he looked into Fleur's eyes, seeing the hope and vulnerability there, he began to wonder if maybe the rules he'd lived by were too small for the love he was feeling. When Sage returned and found all 3 of them talking seriously by the fire, She simply nodded, as if she'd expected this moment to arrive eventually. "The spirits work in mysterious ways," she said simply. "If this is the path they've chosen for you, then Sage will protect it with her life. But first, we must survive, Captain Morrison. Love means nothing if we're all dead before dawn." Captain Morrison arrived at Henri's ranch like a plague of locusts, his 20 soldiers spreading across the property with military precision that spoke of years spent hunting human quarry. Henri watched from his cabin window as the captain dismounted, his cruel face scanning the buildings with the calculating gaze of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. The man's reputation for brutality was legend throughout the territory, and Henri could see why. There was something cold and reptilian in his pale eyes that suggested a complete absence of mercy or conscience. "Henri Beaumont!" Morrison called out, his voice carrying the arrogant authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Federal business. Come out with your hands visible." Henri took a deep breath, kissed each of the sisters quickly on the forehead for luck, and stepped onto his porch with his hands raised. Behind him, he could hear the sisters moving to predetermined positions, Sage to the back window with her rifle, Etoile and Fleur to the root cellar where they could escape if necessary. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied Henri's face, clearly looking for signs of deception or guilt. "I'm tracking 3 Comanche fugitives, dangerous criminals wanted for murder and theft of federal property. Witnesses placed them in this area, and you're the only settler within 20 miles. I trust you understand the serious penalties for harboring enemy Indians during wartime?" The threat in his voice was unmistakable, but Henri had faced worse things than corrupt cavalry officers. "I live alone, Captain," Henri replied calmly, his years of solitude making the lie easier to tell convincingly. "Haven't seen any Indians, Comanche or otherwise. You're welcome to search the property if you think I'm lying." The offer was calculated. If Morrison found evidence of the sisters' presence, Henri could claim ignorance, saying they must have passed through without his knowledge. It was thin protection, but better than nothing. Morrison signaled to his men, who began a systematic search of the barn, outbuildings, and surrounding area. Henri watched with carefully controlled anxiety as soldiers poked through every hiding place except the root cellar, which was concealed beneath a false floor in the kitchen. The search took an hour, but Henri's preparations proved adequate. There was no obvious evidence that anyone besides himself had been living on the ranch. As the soldiers reported their findings, Henri saw frustration building in Morrison's eyes and knew the real danger was just beginning. Morrison wasn't satisfied with the soldiers' report, and Henri could see the captain's predatory instincts telling him there was more to discover. "Interesting ranch you have here, Beaumont," Morrison said conversationally, his tone deceptively casual as he studied the cabin's interior. "Very clean, very organized, almost like you've been expecting company." His pale eyes lingered on details that might reveal the presence of additional occupants, extra dishes, multiple sleeping areas, signs of feminine habitation. Henri forced himself to remain calm even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "I like things neat," he replied simply. "Learned it from my mother back in Louisiana. She always said a clean house reflected a clean conscience." The reference to his family was calculated to humanize him in the captain's eyes, though Henri doubted Morrison possessed enough humanity to be influenced by such considerations. "Louisiana, eh?" Morrison's interest seemed genuine, but Henri recognized it as an interrogation technique. "Long way from home. What brings a Louisiana Frenchman to the middle of nowhere, Texas?" The captain's questions were designed to establish Henri's background and motivations, searching for inconsistencies that might reveal hidden agendas or divided loyalties. Henri told his story carefully: the fever that killed his family, the grief that drove him west, the 7 years of solitude that had finally given him peace. Morrison listened with the attention of a professional interrogator, occasionally asking follow-up questions designed to trip up a liar. But Henri's story was true in all its essential elements, and his pain over losing Marie and Jean-Baptiste was real enough to convince even the most cynical observer. As the conversation continued, Henri became aware of subtle sounds from beneath the floorboards. The sisters moving carefully in the root cellar, trying to remain hidden while staying close enough to help if the situation turned violent. The knowledge that they were so near yet so vulnerable made every moment feel like walking on a tightrope over an abyss. One wrong word, one suspicious sound, and the woman he was learning to love would face torture, death, or worse, at Morrison's hands. Morrison's questions grew more pointed as his suspicions deepened. "You know, Beaumont, it's funny thing about tracking fugitives," he said with false friendliness. "You start to develop an instinct for when someone's hiding something. And right now, my instincts are screaming that you're not telling me the whole truth." His hand rested casually on his pistol grip, a gesture that wasn't lost on Henri or the soldiers watching the exchange. Henri met the captain's stare without flinching, drawing on reserves of courage he'd discovered in his darkest moments of grief. "With respect, Captain, my truth is my own business unless it involves federal crimes. I've told you I haven't seen your fugitives, and I've let you search my property. Unless you have evidence suggesting otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you'd move your investigation elsewhere." The boldness of Henri's response clearly surprised Morrison, who was accustomed to frontier settlers cowering before his authority. "Evidence?" Morrison laughed coldly. "I am the evidence out here, Frenchman. My word is law, and my suspicions are good enough to justify whatever actions I deem necessary." The threat was explicit now, and Henri could see several soldiers shifting uncomfortably at their captain's cavalier attitude toward legal procedure. From beneath the floorboards came the faintest sound, a board creaking under shifting weight. Morrison's head snapped toward the noise, his predator's instincts immediately alert. "What was that?" he demanded, his hand moving to his weapon. Henri's mind raced for an explanation that wouldn't expose the sisters, knowing that the next few seconds could determine whether they all lived or died. "Probably rats," Henri said with calculated disgust. "Been fighting them all summer. Root cellars the worst. They get into the stored food and make themselves at home. I keep meaning to set more traps, but they're cunning little devils." The explanation was plausible enough, and Morrison's momentary hesitation gave Henri hope that the danger might pass. But the captain's eyes remained suspicious, and Henri knew they weren't out of danger yet. Morrison ordered 2 of his soldiers to investigate the root cellar, and Henri's heart nearly stopped as he watched them approach the hidden entrance beneath his kitchen floor. In moments, they would discover Étoile and Fleur hiding below, and everything would be lost. But before the soldiers could locate the concealed trap door, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Sage had created a diversion by appearing at the edge of the forest, deliberately exposing herself to draw the soldiers away from her sisters. "There!" Morrison shouted, pointing toward Sage's distant figure. "One of them! Take her alive if possible. She can tell us where the others are hiding." Half his soldiers mounted quickly and rode toward the forest, their captain's bloodlust making them careless and eager. Henri watched in admiration and terror as Sage led them on a chase that would test both her skills and their horses' endurance. With most of the soldiers gone, Henri found himself facing Morrison and only 4 remaining men. The odds were still impossible, but at least the sisters in the cellar had a chance of remaining undiscovered. Morrison's attention was focused on the pursuit of Sage, and Henri could hear him muttering about the glory of capturing a dangerous fugitive and the rewards that would follow such a success. But Morrison's greed proved to be his weakness. As he watched the chase through Henri's field glasses, he began describing the bounty on each sister's head and the additional rewards offered for recovering the stolen federal property they carried. Henri realized the captain had no intention of following legal procedure. This was a treasure hunt disguised as law enforcement, and Morrison planned to claim everything of value for himself. The revelation gave Henri an idea that was either brilliant or suicidal. If Morrison was operating outside the law for personal gain, then perhaps he could be reasoned with in terms he'd understand. "Captain," Henri said carefully, "perhaps we could discuss this situation as businessmen rather than lawman and citizen. I suspect we might have more in common than either of us initially realized." Morrison turned from the field glasses with interest, his greedy nature immediately alert to potential profit. Morrison's eyes lit up with avarice as Henri began his carefully planned deception. "You see, Captain, I may have been less than completely honest about my relationship with these fugitives," Henri said, adopting the tone of a conspirator sharing secrets. "The truth is, I've been tracking them myself. There are certain collectors back east who pay extraordinary sums for authentic Indian artifacts, no questions asked." The captain's demeanor shifted immediately from suspicion to interest. "Go on," he said, his greed overcoming his caution. Henri could see the wheels turning in Morrison's head as he calculated potential profits from whatever sacred objects the sisters might be carrying. The man's corruption was so complete that he couldn't conceive of anyone acting from purely honorable motives. "The artifacts they're carrying are worth more than your annual salary," Henri continued, embellishing the truth with details designed to inflame Morrison's avarice. "Ancient ceremonial items, blessed by generations of medicine men, sought after by private collectors who care nothing for their spiritual significance. But these women are clever. They've hidden their treasure well, and it will take finesse to extract its location from them." Morrison nodded eagerly, already planning how to spend his imagined windfall. "What do you propose?" he asked, his earlier hostility replaced by the friendliness of potential business partners. Henri had counted on the captain's greed overwhelming his judgment, and the strategy was working perfectly. Now came the dangerous part, convincing Morrison to trust him enough to make a fatal mistake. "Give me time alone with them," Henri suggested. "I've been building their confidence for days, making them believe I'm sympathetic to their cause. With the right approach, I can learn where they've hidden the artifacts without the violence that might damage valuable relics. We split the profits 50-50, and everyone wins except some dead Indians who don't need treasure anymore." The words tasted like poison in Henri's mouth, but Morrison's increasing excitement told him the deception was working. Morrison's greed made him careless, just as Henri had hoped. The captain agreed to the partnership with an eagerness that would have been laughable if the stakes hadn't been so deadly. "I like the way you think, Frenchman," Morrison said with genuine warmth for the first time since his arrival. "Most settlers out here are too squeamish about Indian affairs, but you understand the realities of frontier business." Henri forced himself to smile and nod as Morrison outlined his plans for capturing and interrogating the sisters. The captain's casual discussion of torture and murder as business tools made Henri's stomach turn, but he maintained his deceptive facade while mentally preparing for the moment when he would turn the tables on this monster. The knowledge that Etoile and Fleur were listening from the root cellar gave him strength. They needed to hear Morrison's true nature exposed, so they'd understand the stakes involved. "Of course, once we have the artifacts, we'll need to eliminate any witnesses," Morrison continued matter-of-factly. "Can't have word getting back to federal authorities about our little enterprise. I trust that won't be a problem for you." The casual way he discussed murder revealed the depth of his corruption and confirmed Henri's growing certainty that this man represented everything evil about the so-called civilizing mission of westward expansion. Henri nodded as if agreeing while his mind raced through possibilities for turning the situation to their advantage. Morrison had reduced his guard now that he believed Henri was a fellow criminal, and the remaining soldiers seemed more interested in the distant chase than in watching their captain's back. If Henri could create the right opportunity, He might be able to neutralize the immediate threat and give the sisters a chance to escape. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his planning as the soldiers returned from their unsuccessful pursuit of Sage. Their faces showed frustration and embarrassment at being outmaneuvered by a single Indian woman, and Henri could see Morrison's anger building as he realized his prize had slipped away. The captain's rage made him even more dangerous, but it also made him more likely to make the kind of mistake Henri was hoping for. Morrison's fury at losing Sage made him abandon all pretense of legal procedure. "Burn everything!" he roared at his soldiers. "If we can't catch them in the open, we'll smoke them out of whatever holes they're hiding in." The order to commit arson revealed the full extent of his corruption and gave Henri the justification he needed for what he was about to do. Several soldiers looked uncomfortable with the illegal order, but military discipline kept them obedient, despite their obvious moral qualms. Henri watched in horror as they began soaking his barn with coal oil, preparing to destroy everything he'd built during his 7 years of solitude. But worse than the loss of property was the knowledge that Étoile and Fleur were still hidden beneath the cabin floor. If the building caught fire, they would be trapped and burned alive. "Captain," Henri said urgently, "perhaps we should search more thoroughly before resorting to destruction. The artifacts might be hidden inside the buildings, and fire could damage them beyond repair." It was a desperate attempt to buy time. But Morrison's greed made him pause to consider the possibility of destroying valuable treasure through hasty action. The brief delay gave Henri the opportunity he'd been waiting for. As Morrison turned to countermand his burn order, Henri struck with the speed of a rattlesnake, his knife finding the gap between the captain's ribs before the corrupt officer could react. Morrison's eyes widened in shock and disbelief as he realized he'd been betrayed by the man he'd thought was his partner in crime. The soldiers reacted with confusion rather than immediate violence, uncertain whether Henri was a criminal or a patriot removing a corrupt superior. The hesitation gave Henri precious seconds to grab Morrison's pistol and position himself defensively. "Your captain was planning to steal federal property and murder civilians," Henri announced loudly. "I'm a loyal citizen preventing a crime against the United States government." The words were calculated to appeal to the soldiers' sense of duty and give them an excuse to abandon their illegal orders. The confrontation exploded into violence as some soldiers chose loyalty to their fallen captain while others hesitated, uncertain about the legality of their orders. Henri fought with the desperation of a man defending everything he held dear, using Morrison's body as a shield while returning fire with the dead captain's weapons. The cabin erupted in gunfire and chaos with bullets splintering wood and shattering windows around him. From the root cellar came sounds of movement as Étoile and Fleur prepared to join the battle, but Henri shouted for them to stay hidden until the shooting stopped. Their safety was more important than any help they might provide, and he was determined to protect them even if it cost him his life. The knowledge that they were depending on him gave him strength beyond anything he'd ever imagined possible. Sage appeared at the forest edge, her rifle adding deadly precision to Henri's desperate defense. She picked off soldiers with the skill of a master marksman, each shot carefully placed to disable rather than kill when possible. Her intervention turned the tide of battle, forcing the remaining soldiers to take cover and giving Henri breathing room to assess the situation. "Surrender!" Henri called out to the remaining soldiers. "Your captain is dead. Your orders were illegal. And you're now fighting against a federal citizen on his own property. Lay down your weapons, and you'll be treated according to military law." Several soldiers took the opportunity to escape, clearly wanting no part of a fight they'd never understood or supported. The battle ended with 3 soldiers dead, 2 wounded, and the rest fled into the countryside. Henri stood among the wreckage of his peaceful ranch, breathing heavily and trying to process what had just happened. In the space of an hour, he'd killed a federal officer, fought a running gun battle with cavalry soldiers, and transformed from a quiet rancher into a fugitive from military justice. But as Etoile and Fleur emerged from their hiding place and ran into his arms, he knew he'd made the right choice. The aftermath of the battle left Henri's ranch a war zone, with bodies scattered across the yard and buildings damaged by gunfire. As Sage helped tend the wounded soldiers with the practical compassion of someone who understood that today's enemies might be tomorrow's allies, Henri found himself holding both Etoile and Fleur in his arms, all three of them trembling with relief and adrenaline and the knowledge that they'd somehow survived the impossible. "We can't stay here," Sage said pragmatically as she finished bandaging a soldier's wounded arm. "Word of this fight will spread, and more soldiers will come, probably with orders to shoot first and ask questions later. We need to disappear into the wilderness until the truth can be sorted out." Her assessment was accurate but heartbreaking. Henri's 7 years of building a life on this ranch were ending in a single day of violence. Etoile and Fleur helped Henri gather essential supplies, while Sage prepared the horses for a journey that might last weeks or months. The intimate cooperation required for their hurried preparations felt like a preview of the life they might build together if they could survive long enough to find safety. Each shared glance, each moment of coordinated effort deepened the bonds forming between all three of them. "Henri," Fleur said softly as they worked side by side, "what we discussed before about unconventional arrangements. Do you think such things could work for people like us? People who might never have a normal life in settled society?" Her question carried weight beyond its simple words, asking whether love could survive in the wilderness, whether three hearts could truly beat as one. Henri paused in his packing to look at both sisters, seeing strength and beauty and devotion that made his chest tight with emotion. "I think," he said carefully, "that love makes its own rules, and people brave enough to follow their hearts can build happiness anywhere. If you'll have me, both of you, then I'll spend my life proving that unconventional can still be true." The promise felt like a sacred vow, witnessed by the setting sun and blessed by the same spirits that had brought them together. Their flight from the ranch felt like a death and rebirth simultaneously, the end of Henri's solitary life and the beginning of something unprecedented and beautiful. They rode hard through the night, following game trails and creek beds that would hide their tracks from pursuing cavalry. Sage led them with the confidence of someone who'd learned wilderness survival from birth, while Henri provided knowledge of the local terrain gained from 7 years of exploring every corner of his territory. By dawn, they'd reached a hidden canyon that Sage had discovered during her hunting expeditions, a place where water, shelter, and concealment combined to create a natural fortress. Ancient cliff dwellings carved into the rock face provided protection from weather and observation, while springs and game ensured they could survive indefinitely if necessary. It was a place outside civilization, beyond the reach of corrupt officers and unjust laws. As they set up their temporary camp, the reality of their new situation began to sink in. They were outlaws now, fugitives from a justice system that wouldn't distinguish between Henri's heroic defense of innocent women and Morrison's criminal corruption. But instead of despair, Henri felt a strange sense of liberation. Free from society's expectations and judgments, they could finally explore the unconventional love that had been growing between them. Etoile approached him as he tended the horses, her eyes serious but not sad. "Do you regret it?" she asked simply. "Giving up everything you built for 3 strangers who brought nothing but trouble to your peaceful life?" The question was fair, and Henri considered it carefully before answering, wanting to give her the complete truth rather than easy reassurances. "The only thing I regret," Henri said finally, "is not finding you sooner. That ranch was just a place I hid from life after losing my family, but this, what we're building together, this is actually living. I'd rather have 1 year of real love with you and Fleur than a lifetime of safe solitude." His words brought tears to Étoile's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow, and when she kissed him under the vast western sky, Henri knew he'd found his true home at last. The weeks that followed in their hidden canyon became a time of discovery and deepening connection that transformed all their lives. Free from the conventions and judgments of civilized society, Henri, Étoile, and Fleur explored the possibilities of their unconventional relationship with honesty, patience, and a love that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker when shared among three hearts. Sage, initially skeptical of the arrangement, gradually came to see the genuine happiness it brought her sisters and gave her blessing to something she'd never imagined possible. Henri learned to love differently than he ever had before. Not the exclusive, possessive passion he'd shared with his late wife, but something more complex and generous that somehow enhanced rather than diminished his feelings for each woman. Étoile challenged his mind and soul with deep conversations and spiritual insights that expanded his understanding of life's possibilities. Fleur nurtured his heart with gentle affection and artistic beauty that healed wounds he hadn't even realized he carried. The sisters, too, found their relationship evolving in unexpected ways. Rather than creating jealousy or competition, their shared love for Henri seemed to strengthen the bonds between them as siblings. They supported each other through moments of uncertainty, celebrated each other's happiness, and created a family structure that felt more natural and sustainable than anything they'd known in their traditional tribal life. Their days fell into rhythms that felt timeless and sacred, hunting and gathering together, sharing meals around fires that warmed both body and spirit, telling stories that wove their separate histories into a single narrative of love overcoming impossible odds. At night, they slept under stars that seemed to bless their unconventional union, taking turns holding each other and whispering promises that bound them together more surely than any formal ceremony. But even in paradise, reality intruded in the form of distant smoke columns and the sound of search parties combing the wilderness for the fugitives who'd killed a cavalry captain. Their hidden canyon was safe for now, but Henri knew they couldn't hide forever. Eventually, they would need to find a way to clear their names and build a legitimate life together, or risk spending their entire future as outlaws running from a justice system that would never understand the love that had driven them to desperate measures. The solution to their predicament came from an unexpected source, the sacred bundle that the sisters had hidden before arriving at Henri's ranch. Étoile finally led them to its concealment place, a natural shrine formed by wind-carved rocks, where her people had left offerings for generations. The bundle itself was smaller than Henri had expected, but radiated an almost palpable sense of power and significance that made the hair on his arms stand up. "These artifacts predate any white settlement in this territory," Étoile explained, as she carefully unwrapped objects that seemed to glow with their own inner light. "They're not just valuable to collectors, they're legal proof that our people have sacred claims to this land that supersede any government grants or military seizures. Morrison knew this, which is why he was so desperate to steal them and why he was operating outside legal channels." Sage examined the documents and artifacts with growing excitement, her warrior's pragmatism recognizing their strategic value. "If we can get these to honest federal authorities, people not corrupted by Morrison's criminal network, we can prove that he was the real criminal and that Henri was defending legitimate property owners from an illegal seizure." The plan was dangerous, but offered their only hope of clearing their names and building a legal future together. Fleur added her own insight to their planning, her artistic eye recognizing symbols and markings that confirmed the artifact's authenticity and age. "These pieces tell the story of our people's connection to this land going back centuries," she said softly. "They're not just legal evidence, they're spiritual testimony to truths that existed long before white men came with their laws and boundaries." Henri felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders as he realized they were carrying more than just their own hopes for happiness. The sacred bundle represented the survival of an entire people's spiritual heritage, and its proper preservation could mean the difference between cultural death and renewal for tribes throughout the territory. Their love story had become part of something much larger than themselves, a struggle for justice that would determine the future of an entire region. 6 months later, Henri stood in the territorial courthouse, holding Etoile's hand on one side and Fleur's on the other, watching as federal investigators concluded their examination of the evidence that had finally cleared their names. The sacred bundle had indeed proven Morrison's corruption and illegality, leading to a wider investigation that exposed a network of criminal officials who had been systematically stealing tribal lands for personal profit. Henri's killing of Morrison was ruled justifiable homicide in defense of lawful property owners, but the legal victory was just the beginning of their triumph. The federal government, embarrassed by the corruption scandal and eager to demonstrate good faith toward native peoples, had granted the sisters legal title to their ancestral lands, including the territory where Henri's ranch was located. They were no longer fugitives or refugees, but legitimate landowners with the right to build the life they dreamed of during their months in hiding. The unconventional marriage that had seemed impossible in civilized society found acceptance in the unique circumstances of frontier justice. Federal authorities, more concerned with establishing peaceful relations with tribal peoples than enforcing social conventions, recognized the union as a legitimate alliance between cultures. Henri had become not just a husband, but a bridge between worlds, helping to establish trading relationships and peaceful coexistence that benefited everyone involved. Sage had found her own happiness in their extended family, serving as both protector and elder sister to a growing household that included the 3 original partners plus children who would grow up seeing love as something that transcended traditional boundaries. The canyon that had been their hiding place became their permanent home, expanded and improved into a ranch that welcomed visitors from both white and native communities. As Henri watched his wives, for that was how he thought of them both, playing with their children in the evening light, he marveled at the journey that had brought them from desperate fugitives to a family blessed by both human law and divine providence. Their love had indeed conquered impossible odds. But more than that, it had become a force for healing in a broken world. The lonely rancher who had lived for years in isolation had found not just love, but purpose, meaning, and a legacy that would endure for generations. Under the same stars that had witnessed their first desperate flight, Henri whispered a prayer of gratitude for the day when 3 beautiful Comanche women had walked into his life and taught him that love, like the prairie itself, was vast enough to hold any dream brave enough to take root and grow.